Before getting to the main topic of this talk this morning, which will be reading and commenting on a paragraph by Huang Po on dying, let me read parts of a letter received a few weeks ago. I'm not reading the whole letter, I'm reading parts of it. Anyone who wishes to read the whole letter can ask about it. Dear Toni, I've been thinking a lot lately about the influence that teachers can have on their students, and would like to say some things and make a suggestion regarding ourselves and the way we work at the GV. That particular part, the suggestion, is not going to be read. The author of this letter has agreed to put a synopsis of his suggestion on the bulletin board. Anybody can read it and give feedback on it. Or if anybody wishes to discuss this whole matter further, please say so in the discussion box where you drop a note in. It's a matter of the authority carried by people in the role of teachers. I'll read the first thing. I read everything first and later comment. But keep in mind, it's not the whole letter. These are excerpts. It's a matter of the authority carried by people in the role of teachers, even when unsought. They receive authority in some degree automatically, just by the fact of their having taken on that role, and also by the tendency of people to grant that authority grossly or subtly out of a need for someone to direct them or tell them how things are in quotation marks, in one way or another. The words spoken in talks can go quite deep, which is partly the value of talks, given in a context of sitting, but it is also the danger. Students are encouraged to listen openly and not let the teacher's words stick in the mind, but so often they do. And they do carry to your listeners your own way of seeing some things, and the opinions that at times seem to be embedded in your words, if not clearly expressed by them. How else could it be you are an individual with the limitations of one person's experience of things and the point or points of view arising from this? Whether one agrees to the presence of opinion and point of view or not is irrelevant, however. Even if talks were devoid of opinion and had only and always clear seeing informing them, there would still be the overwhelming effect that one particular voice personality can have on the mind. And that voice personality often gets a hold in the mind and repeats itself again and again. Already the voice carries some authority because it belongs to the teacher and because it lays out in some sense, quote, how things are, unquote, even when the mode of expression is that of posing questions. In parentheses, sometimes answers are suggested by the structure and context of the questions, end of parentheses. Then the voice gathers more authority by being the only one heard in the middle of vast silence. Added to that, your words carry the force of your own, formidable or formidable? Personality, that is your intensity, energy, and your definitive way of putting things. All in all, your talks, given in the context of sitting, and especially at retreats, carry a great deal of power and authority. And this, I feel, poses a serious problem. You ask people to question things and look for themselves, but in fact, this often doesn't happen. Probably many people are still afraid to look closely at authority and question what is being said, or some aspect of what is being said, for fear of unraveling the rug they may have found to stand on. In parentheses, I've noticed how subtly rugs can appear under the feet. End of parentheses. It's still very compelling for many of us not to question too closely, but to accept a whole lot on authority, even when we think we're being open and questioning. Or even when we're not thinking at all, but seeing clearly. I'll stop here with a letter. Just make some comments on a few points. How can I start without imposing authority? Without divesting myself of whatever is called my personality, the sound of the voice, the intensity and energy. Or turning it around, how can you find out for yourself whether what is being said is so or is not so? I can tell you as often as I have that I'm not here to convince anybody, persuade somebody, put a point of view over on somebody. But that's not enough, my saying so, because you may feel that I'm doing that. How can you tell whether what is said is a point of view, opposing other points of view, or is actually so? Which means as soon as you want the person who's speaking to be right, then you already cannot tell. If you're invested in that person, identified with that person as your teacher, who's always right, then all doubt and criticalness is gone. You can't tell. You don't want to tell. Because you want to be right what this person says. Can that be seen? Which means one has to scrutinize oneself very carefully to what extent one is identified and wants to hear something that one can take over. How is it possible to listen not just to this person, to anybody, without being swayed by personality, charisma, traditional authority, whatever? And who can do it for you? Who can do it for me? Don't you have to, I don't know if it's possible. I don't see why it should not be possible. Put personality, voice, energy, all of that on the side. Because personality is not important. What is important is that you see what is so and what is false for yourself, without any influence, because it's clear, and not because somebody else says so. Which means you have nothing to go by. if you have something to go by, some other authority in which you're invested, some belief, some dogma or parts of a dogma that appeals to you, that you're holding on to, that is comfortable, or that has never been questioned, has never even been realized to be dogma or belief. Unless this is questioned and seen, one is blind at that particular spot, or fuzzy. I'm not saying this to make an authoritative statement. This is so. It is verifiable by yourself. If this is what one needs to do in one's life, to be free from all influence and all authority, so that this capacity to see for oneself, to understand for oneself, and maybe in that stand alone, so that come into being, into life and action. It says the tendency of people to grant that authority grossly or subtly out of a need for someone to direct them or tell them how things are. I'm not trying to tell you how things are so that you believe it because I say it forcefully. Maybe I can work on that myself, to work with less force. It's not really force, it's the intensity of concern with this whole thing, which is expressing itself this way. But things are how they are, not because I say so. If something is pointed out, it's for everyone to see. Or if it is not so, then to challenge what has been said, which can be done in a meeting, in the office, in a question period, or I bring it up in talks. If you detect what is opinion in your way of seeing it, bring it up. I've often been asked by people, bring more personal examples into the talks, or else it's too hard to get hold of, too inaccessible. I hesitate to bring in personal examples because then there comes this personal element. And yet, the work is always to try to bring out what is universally so, and not just personally. If it is too limited, tell me about it. We'll look at it, and if needs be, bring it up in front of everybody next time. There's no hesitation here to do that. Because I don't feel personally identified with what is being said. It's very clear that words are very inadequate and very difficult to find, to express what is seen. Words are always limited and subject to misunderstanding. if words that are spoken here stick in the mind, and people have told me about this, one is free to look at this process itself. Listen to this voice. Be clear of whose voice it is, because it is memory that is taking place. And to look whether what is said there in the memory, whether that can be discerned in reality, whether something like this is actually so. Or is when repeating words to comfort oneself, or think I should be doing what this voice says, and I'm not doing it? Or is it just a habitual record, as one often has a musical song turning over and over in the mind? The moment one becomes aware of that and really listens to it, it stops. It's a form of inattention with background music. And so can be the spoken voice somebody one has heard. But there may be much more hiding underneath this, really wanting authority. And the either inertness or resistance to look for oneself, or thinking one can't do it. The conviction that one is incapable of doing this. Maybe at a future time I will be able to. But right now I'm going by what a person with a strong personality and an energetic voice says. You see the danger of that. If one can't discern here what is so and what isn't so, how can one discern it anywhere? Whether one listens to a politician, a religious leader, a spiritual person imbued with ideology, or sometimes it's very subtle. How can one tell whether what anybody says is so? Is one dependent on believing someone? Or will one break out all over the place looking, questioning, at the risk of standing alone? Which means not depending on anyone's authority, including the authority of one's own opinions, which is not to be underestimated. One may rebel against all external authority and go what oneself has built up as one's belief or opinion or thoughts or past experience. That's a tremendous authority in that. My past experience tells me this is so. But it's a memory. It's not what is going on this instant. It can only be the clarity of seeing if it is disconnected from past experience. And if one is really free to look, not tied up any place, invested someplace, which makes for our blind spots. So can blind spots come into awareness? Sounds totally paradoxical, but it's possible. If there's this urge to see and to understand and to observe from moment to moment how one reacts. It says here at two places that the role that the person takes on as a teacher, I would prefer not to call it a role myself. I don't see myself in any role. I'm not role-playing. You may perceive it this way, If you do and you see any danger in this or how it affects you, please bring it up. Role always comes with a certain facade, a certain pretense. I don't say that the writer of this letter meant it this way. Role-playing means I'm this moment, and at that moment I'm that. I change hats as an expression. Maybe sitting around the kitchen table, the voice is different than it is when addressing people who are sitting close and far away. It has nothing to do with playing a role. And I'm not asking you to believe this. It's up to you how you see it. Maybe one more word about posing questions. It says here, the teacher's voice lays out in some sense how things are, even when the mode of expression is that of posing questions. Sometimes answers are suggested by the structure and context of the questions. I'm not saying that the author of this letter means it this way, but it could mean that there's a little trickiness involved, posing a question and structuring it such a way that you give the answer. There's no such thing intended. But it's from the very beginning that I started doing this work. Some people brought this up to me. You're making statements. You're not really you think you're asking questions, or you pretend you're asking questions, but you're making one statement after another. And we looked at it together with people who were concerned about this and felt this way. And then we found that very often when a question is asked, one gives an answer because one is conditioned to do so, since from the very beginning of being in this language game. Don't mean it derogatorily. One gives the answer. The question is asked and one gives the answer, and the recollection is, Toni has said such and such, but she hasn't. She's asked. And one doesn't have to give the answer. It's not meant to immediately answer, because that stops all questioning. And as the writer here says, makes an authoritative statement out of what is not meant to be one. Very often, if not most of the time, when I ask a question, I'm asking it with you. Look, so that we can look together. And the immediate answers usually come from the intellect. If a question hovers around either as words or that one remembers, or as the voice that one hears, if that question is operating in oneself, so that one starts looking, is this so? Let me see, let me observe. Then it functions. It doesn't let one go. Does it matter then in what form it it sticks in the mind. As long as it remains a question, inviting or impelling to look, dive and delve deeply into oneself. Here, saying, you ask people to question things, but in fact this often doesn't happen. It's very important. It says here, a footnote, this has been my impression from hearing people talk. More important than what happens to other people in this whole process is what happens here to myself. Because it's very difficult to really discern very clearly what happens in another person. Maybe not quite as hard than to discern what happens in oneself. It says, probably many people are still afraid to look closely at authority and question what is being said. Fear of unraveling the rug they may have found to stand on. How is it with me? Myself, I want to know. Do I stand on rugs? Am I afraid to look? What are these rugs, these fabrics to which I hold on? And no one can do the looking for me, and no one can unravel it. It unravels itself in the seeing. Only when there's no authority, threatening or beckoning. Says here, it's still very compelling for many of us not to question, but to accept a whole lot on authority, even when we think we're being open and questioning. This is clear. Then the next is not clear. It says, even when we're not thinking at all, but seeing clearly. Because seeing clearly is in quotation marks. If the person means one thinks one sees clearly, that's not seeing clearly. Obviously, it's thinking. But when there's seeing and not thinking, then there's no authority. Then there's no taking over. That reveals itself in the seeing, that this is happening. And dissolves if the seeing is whole, without investment or fear of loss of investment. I'll leave this for the time being. If you wish to discuss this further, let us know. It's a passage from the Zen teaching of Wang Po, which has been read very frequently. It's not read to invoke the authority of Wang Po. But to listen and look. If an ordinary man, when he's about to die, could only see the 5 elements of consciousness as void, the 4 physical elements as not constituting an I, capital I, the real mind as formless and neither coming nor going, his nature as something neither commencing at his birth nor perishing at his death, but as whole and motionless in its very depth, his mind and environmental objects as one. If he could really accomplish this, he would receive enlightenment in a flash. He would no longer be entangled by the triple world. He would be a world transcender. He would be without even the faintest tendency towards rebirth. If he should behold the glorious sight of all the Buddhas coming to welcome him, surrounded by every kind of gorgeous manifestation, he would feel no desire to approach them. If he should behold all sorts of horrific forms surrounding him, he would experience no terror. He would just be himself, oblivious of conceptual thought and one with the Absolute. He would have attained the state of unconditioned being. This, then, is the fundamental principle. If one reads this or hears this, thinking that Huang Po may be talking about death at whatever time it may strike us, this may become something to look forward to, or to postpone. Well, let's wait when that happens. But he may not be talking about the time of actual physical dying, but may talk about this instant as the only way in which I can look at this paragraph meaningfully. If you wish to do that, we can do that together. If a man, which stands for a human being, about to die, could only see the 5 elements of consciousness as void, five elements of consciousness does not mean here 5 sections out of a total consciousness which contains more sections. It means the totality of consciousness. Thinking, feeling, emoting, judging, willing, desiring, fearing, you name it. The whole thing. Memories, anticipations, joy, sorrow, ambition, wanting to attain, wanting to become, fear of not becoming, pride of having become, wanting love, fearing loss of love, the whole thing. Everything that has moved human consciousness since time immemorial. That is human consciousness. The whole thing. Here, 5 elements are some way of getting at it descriptively, but it's there, isn't it? The whole consciousness, Wang Po says, as void. What does it mean? The whole consciousness as void. It can't mean one's absorption is in one aspect of it, because at that moment one is full of it, entangled in it. Pulled by it, pushed by it, attracted or repelled. One instant of glimpsing that, is that glimpse void? Meaning not wanting what appears to be different. That's not void, that's wanting, comparing, fearing to be what one doesn't want to be. What is this glimpse or insight? Name it whatever you want to, the word is not important. Which is free from all partiality, all judgment. One's whole heavy background of conditioning and projecting. It is this state of mind which doesn't know. He goes on, the 4 physical elements as not constituting an I or a me means the whole body, the whole thing, with which one is so identified. Picturing some me in there, a soul or an entity, something permanent, indestructible, maybe called true nature or Buddha nature. Every religion gives it a different name. Soul or the spark of God, the divine spark. Which, if you look at it right this moment, as they're mentioned, are thoughts to which one clings, because there's dread and fear of impermanency, of getting old and dying. He says, the physical elements as not constituting an I. One has to grapple with this. If this is not clear, because it seems so convincing, so self-evident that there's me here. But what is this me that you say is here? Other than looking and listening, that needs no me. But you say, but I am looking. But then what is that I? When you say that, look at it. Whether this isn't already a thought and an image that thinks is looking out of here. And this power of looking, of questioning and glimpsing, that has nothing to do with I or me, unless one immediately thinks about it and says, I have seen something. Then one has informed it with the idea of me. But the seeing itself is without form. Wang Po goes on, he says, the real mind is formless and neither coming nor going. Maybe one wants to find out sometime, what is this whole thing of coming and going? One can sit down and just listen to sounds. Just listen to them. Without any idea. And noticing how ideas are heavily there and therefore there's no listening. But if this is important enough and urgent enough, or interesting enough, maybe in listening again and again freshly, the ideas will drop, will vanish, recede, and then there's just sound. And then one asks, what is coming and going? Do it yourself. I'm not saying you must do it yourself. This may already be interpreted this way. It's up to you. I'm not telling you what to do. It may sound like this, but I'm not. It's your life. Listen. Where is the sound coming from or going to? Or is this already ideas coming in there? Goes on, his nature is something neither commencing at his birth nor perishing at his death, but is whole and motionless in its very depths. In sitting, open, listening, not knowing, ideas that come up, putting them aside again, one sees these are ideas and thoughts. What is birth or death? The moment you think about it, what is it? Other than thought? Do you see that? Don't take it from anybody. Look at it yourself, if you need to. And there's sitting motionless in its very depth, not knowing in its very depth. What is birth and what is death? his mind and environmental objects as one. Try to resolve this intellectually, drives one nuts. If one leaves it alone as an intellectual problem and listens, without wanting or knowing, or rejecting, or running away, then what is there? When there's no opposition from anyone. Says here, if he could really accomplish this, he would receive enlightenment in a flash, which in itself, as we listen to it or read it, think about it, is a very, potentially very dangerous sentence. Because just reading it, one wants it. And it says here, accomplish, one doesn't know what the Chinese text says, because this is no accomplishment. It has nothing to do with our conventional idea of accomplishing. Accomplishing always means that there is an accomplisher, a driver, a striver, a wanter, and his goal, which is separate. And receive is a questionable word, because there is no receiver when environmental objects and mind is one. What receiver could there be? There's only what is. And that changes. So at that moment, what is enlightenment? If that word is there, it is an idea, something one wants or wants to know now. Have I accomplished enlightenment? Which is the end of this state of no division, of oneness. Do you see that? Says he would no longer be entangled in the triple world. Triple world meaning yesterday, today, and tomorrow. What happened yesterday is finished, over with, irretrievably so, just a memory. If one clings to it, if one is finished with it, even the memory fades away, it is unimportant and a hindrance to seeing what is now. The presence, if one looks at it carefully as one uses the word, is also a concept. Because if one is really with something, be it anger or joy or washing the dishes, there's no thought, I'm in the here and now. That concept is not there. It's only there when we're thinking and wish we were. And the future is what we want, fear and hope for, based on what we already know. A construct of thoughts. not entangled in that, understanding how time, this type of time, comes into being, and how it need not entangle one, because one understands its substance, what it's made up of, its ingredients. It's thought, thinking, hoping, remembering, wanting, fearing, all thoughts with the corresponding accompanying emotions. Sometimes people say to me, oh, always also much talk about thoughts, but there's much more going on in me than just thoughts. Obviously, not just in you, in all of us. If one observes carefully, one thought can trigger total turmoil in throughout the whole organism. Pain, fear, franticness, panic, bliss. It says here he would be without even the faintest tendency toward rebirth. Meaning no thought of rebirth, no desire for rebirth. Because in this state, which is attempted to be described here, every moment is rebirth. Meaning this sloughing, as a snake sloughs, or what's the proper pronunciation, is that it? An old skin, it stays behind. It still looks like a snake, but it's dead, empty, finished, no longer useful. Being afraid of death, rebirth can be a very comforting idea, just as going to paradise or to the eternal hunting grounds. Because one may not make that, one may go to hell or purgatory, which is a dreadful thought. But it's all thought. Do you see that? If you say right now, I remember my last past life, that is a memory. Of course, all our past lives, all of humanity's past lives sit right here on the mat. We are the heirs of the totality of human experiences and development, evolution, not just human. To think of one's rebirth is a thought. Without thinking about rebirth, there is only this instant. And what is that when there is no thought? Or is it fraught with thought? One can say, I know people who remember their past lives. I know people very reliable, trustworthy, high esteemed and spiritual life systems also, who know past lives, who know that they will be reborn. But what good does this do me, what somebody else knows or thinks? Do I then start believing that? Then I'm tied to a belief, as what we talked about before we came to this passage. tied to belief I can't see freely. I may not want to. That's up to each one of us. No one prescribes here what one is to do or not to do. Thinking of past lives or thinking of future lives is thinking, is knowing. Knowing what one has heard and read or remembers, but it is not free from knowing. It is not knowing. It is limited. What does it mean to die? The 5 elements of consciousness void. Meaning no refuge in knowledge, not even referral to it. Void. Irrelevant. Because as long as it's relevant, one revolves in this realm of consciousness. From one thought to another, from one hope to another, from one fear to hope to fear. If he should behold the glorious sight of all the Buddhas coming to welcome him, surrounded by every kind of gorgeous manifestation, he would feel no desire to approach them. May be mentioned here that this is written by a person in the Buddhist tradition to a Christian dying. There would be no Buddhas appearing. I'm not saying anybody would be appearing. It's not. But if there's a strong belief and hope for someone to stand by or comfort, then there would be Christ. For a Catholic, there may be the Virgin Mary or the saints. Every religion, and I don't know how many there are in this world, has its own visions, symbols, and the pantheon of gods, saints, spirits. Someone said in India there are 300,000 gods. And here it says, if they would all come, appear glorious, gorgeous, no desire to approach them, meaning no desire. No need. This aloneness we talked about. Not abandonedness or loneliness, but aloneness, no need, no dependence on visions or belief or comfort in a future life. And realizing the substance of that belief. It is within the realm of consciousness. Some of it deposited deeply in the human mind. One person recently told me in a retreat, I thought I was completely done with Catholicism. I was already a Buddhist after that, and all of a sudden this original sin and stuff just coming up so powerful. should behold all sorts of horrific forms. He would experience no terror. Maybe desire and fear go together. When there's no desire for something, there's no fear. It is this state of meeting whatever comes, whatever is there, without running away or rushing toward it, without clinging or escaping. And without interpreting it with what one knows. Because it may not be that at all. It isn't. It can't be the memory. Whatever happens this instant is fresh. Memory makes it stale, old, but familiar. And often we feel less threatened, less scared if we're with something familiar, even if it is unpleasant, rather than questioning, what is it if I don't know anything about it? It goes on, it says he would just be himself, oblivious of conceptual thought. This could be the topic for a whole talk. What it means to be just oneself. It's talked about so much in the many different and ever newly appearing therapies and counseling techniques. To become oneself or to be oneself. This is such a longing. I just want to be myself, meaning that one is so tired of facade and tension and pretense, and also tired of being told what to do, having to follow rules, conforming, following, obeying. Fed up with all that. One wants to be oneself, but what is oneself? I think we talked about it yesterday briefly at the workshop. If one thinks it is following one's fancies and one looks carefully, one will find one's fancies are also conditioned and not free. Rebellion is conditioned and not free. So what does it mean to be oneself? What is the self? And not immediately jump in and say there is no self. It's maybe just an idea, but to see what's there. A feeling of inner emptiness and the pain of that. Or envy at somebody else who seems to be so much himself. Comparison. That's myself at this moment. When I think somebody else is so much more himself, there's comparison going on. Can that be seen? Can one see oneself as one is from moment to moment without immediately condemning? Or thinking one is terrific or pretty good. Just looking, observing, and no division between this observation and what is being observed. Then what is oneself? It says here he would have attained the state of unconditioned being, which just read and heard is just a concept. What's the real thing? We will end here for today.